Welcome and salam alaikum. My name is Lisa Schirch. I'm a professor here at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. And today's program on the regional dimensions of peace and security for Afghanistan is part of our ongoing program called AFPAD, the Afghanistan Program on Peace and Development. I will pass this now to my colleague here at Notre Dame, Aref Dostiar. Aref, welcome.
Thank you, Professor Schirch, for your introduction. And I would like to welcome our distinguished panelists and also the audience. The topic of our discussion is the regional aspects of peace and security in Afghanistan. But I'd like to narrow down the topic to the interest and role of the region in the political situation of Afghanistan so that we can have some takeaways by the end of this conversation. This is a complicated topic, but also crucial because no matter how hard or how long we try, it would be impossible to stem the human rights, and other forms of ongoing crises in Afghanistan without addressing the political context. Over the past year, there have been some, even though not enough, regional and also international meetings that have focused on the political situation of Afghanistan. In March, the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan received a strong mandate, which has an important clause on facilitating a process toward an inclusive, representative, and responsive government. In September, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Samarkand described it essential for Afghanistan to have an inclusive system. In October, an Ariel Formula meeting at the UN that was initiated by Norway focused on the political situation in Afghanistan. And the Moscow format meeting in Russia took place in November, which also emphasized on the idea of political inclusivity. So the region and the wider global community does seem to be concerned about the political situation in Afghanistan. I would like to invite our panelists into a discussion about what the region and the broader global community mean by this phrase and how they envision to work with Afghans to address the political crisis. You would know today's speakers already if you are following Afghanistan or the region, but please allow me to briefly introduce them for those who are new to the discussion. Niloufar Sakhi is a professorial lecturer in international affairs at George Washington University. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Over the last semester, Dr. Sakhi has researched at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies on the regional aspects of the crisis in Afghanistan. She has a PhD from George Mason University. We also have Barney Rubin, who is a distinguished fellow with the China program at the Stimson Center and a senior fellow and director of the Afghanistan Regional Program at New York University Center on International Cooperation. He used to be a senior advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan between 2009 and 2013. He has authored countless articles and several books, including Afghanistan from the Cold War through the War on Terror. This year, he visited the region around Afghanistan and wrote a report about his trip, which I read, and I have a few questions for him. We also have Dr. Asfandiar Mir, who is a senior expert in the South Asia program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. His research interests include the international relations of South Asia, U.S. counterterrorism policy, and political violence with a regional focus on Afghanistan and Pakistan. Dr. Mir has a doctorate in political science from the University of Chicago and a master's and a bachelor's from Stanford University. Last but not least, we have Fatima Aman. She is a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute. For the last 20 years, she has contributed considerable number of analytical articles on the situation in Iran, Afghanistan, and the broader region. She has also advised the US government on Iranian regional policies. Mrs. Aman used to be a TV writer, producer, and anchor at Voice of America, and prior to that, a correspondent with Radio Free Europe. First, I would like to invite Dr. Sakhi to situate the discussion in a broader context, and then maybe I'll narrow down the questions as we move the conversation forward. Dr. Sakhi, how has the region's policy of Afghanistan evolved since August 15th last year? And what would you say are the region's common fears and common objectives in Afghanistan?
Well, thank you, Mr. Dusyar. Thank you, Q School of Global Affairs and the Kroc Institute for organizing this webinar. It's a great pleasure to be among such esteemed panelists today. To answer your question, as you said that I have to provide a context, I'll go back a little bit beyond August 15, just to highlight to our audience the policy of engagement of the region with Afghanistan. Historically, Afghanistan is viewed by its neighboring countries both as a threat and opportunities. And as a threat because of its geopolitical location, because of the rugged terrain, because of the weak government, instability, insurgency, and name it, and a frequent transition, actually, radical transition in the country that caused Afghanistan a center for terrorist activities, for insurgency, for poverty that by itself posed a threat to its neighboring countries. An opportunity because historically, again, Afghanistan is seen as a connector between South and Central Asia and the countries in the region, the northern countries, the southern, and also all around Afghanistan. They viewed it as an opportunity to explore, to connect, to trade, and promote transit. So this threat and opportunity perception has been always there historically, even beyond 15 August or whatever we want to name them. And the countries in the region, they cemented their policies based on these threats and opportunities with every government of the time, any government of the time, again, historically. I'll highlight some of the policy that, again, some of them are still actually following the same policy of engagement with the country overall and with its leader. For example, some countries, particularly Central Asian states, had dual policy of engagement with Afghanistan. They were, if we just bring the context of last 20 years, the Republic, Afghanistan Republic time, they were supporting Afghan state and republic on the one hand, and on the other hand, they were involved in the processes that could lead to political reconciliation between the Afghan state and the Taliban. So they were kind of a dual policy of engagement, and most of the Central Asian countries had that policy of engagement with the country for the 20 years. Then the countries such as Pakistan, Iran, they have multilateral policy of engagement with the country. They were supporting Afghan state and the republic for the 20 years of the time. They were also encouraging and pushing for reconciliation and settlement between the Afghanistan and the Taliban. And the third element that particularly these two countries were involved, they were also helping and supporting their proxies inside the country, which was through soft and hard tactics. Like, for example, Iran had all the soft power and soft tactic in order to keep alive and sustain its proxies inside the country. We have examples in Herat, how they have been engaged in Herat. We have examples in Mazar-e-Sharif. We have examples in Hazarajat, that how they used to be, how they used those soft powers in order to expand their influence and also sustain and create environment for survival of their proxies. And the Pakistan, of course, through the hard tactics by supporting the Taliban, who they have been supporting for 20 years, that they use actually in the battlefield, providing weaponry support to their proxy of the time, which used to be the Taliban. So that was a multilateral policy of engagement with Afghanistan from Pakistan, Iran. Now, we had also countries, my study is only around the neighbors. I have been researching a lot and looking closely at the neighboring countries from last couple of years. And China has been a very narrow security focus in the country, though through a period of time, and 20 years also, there were different analyses that, China is involved in the extraction of mines, but China started actually working on extraction of mines in 2009 and 10, but that didn't go anywhere. China claimed that it will support financially the country and invest a lot, but it didn't go anywhere. I mean, the result was very minimal as per the commitment of China. So looking at all of these countries, so they had in a very informal term, of course, one can use an opportunistic policy of engagement, but as I laid out, that was a dual policy of engagement and multilateral policy of engagement in order to be engaged to impede the security threats that I mentioned in terms of the overall threats that the country could pose to them, and the opportunities that Afghanistan has in terms of the economic connectivity and playing as a role of trade for the trade and transit. So, but overall, and things have changed drastically since last year when the Taliban took power. Even before that, I would go back to 2018 when the Doha process started. And in October of 2018, we have seen in early 2019 the signs of course, the regional countries, especially the neighboring countries, they had their connections with the Taliban. As I mentioned, that one of the policies was to facilitate that political reconciliation between the Taliban and the Afghan state, where they had their connections with the Taliban. There are all other political dynamics, which I will keep it for the next round. But just for in the Doha process, what happened? The Doha process gave a perception to the neighboring countries that the next power would be the Taliban, the ruler, though they were not really in favor. None of the regional countries that I look at the statement in Tehran and Moscow and Beijing, they had all the series and rounds of meetings, informal meetings, back-channel diplomacy, and also events which took place in all the centers and the capitals. So they were not really for Islamic Emirate of the Taliban or of Afghanistan. They were not for the complete takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban. They were, from the very beginning, they were vocal about it, and that they wanted an inclusive system. They wanted a political settlement, which they used to work with Afghanistan previously as well. But the Doha, when the Doha agreement signed, we have I have seen a shift in the tune of some of these regional countries, particularly Iran, Central Asian states, and of course, Pakistan. With that, when the Doha agreement was signed, soon there was an event, I remember, in Tehran, and then it was followed by a country in the Central Asia, that there was a kind of a very wide perception among these countries that, okay, the next ruler would be the Taliban. So the best policy is actually engagement. And policy of engagement was from the day one. And they, of course, isolation was not a good policy for all these countries at that particular time. So they started working closely with the Taliban and with the perception that Taliban have changed. So that was the initial perception, especially from countries like Central Asia countries, Pakistan at some point, which they vocally, Imran Khan was conveying those messages of the international platform. Tehran, not really so much. But these countries were working very closely. And Central Asia, particularly, became a place, especially Uzbekistan, became a facilitator of all the humanitarian aid and humanitarian services to Afghanistan. Uzbekistan played that role. Pakistan initially played a role of advocating for Taliban's recognition. Iran, on the other hand, played a role of supporting and guiding the Taliban and becoming a role model for them. So they all have played a role, a political role, an economic role, in order to further interact, engage with the Taliban as they perceived and accepted them as a ruler of the country. As I mentioned, policy of isolation was not in favor of them. And on the other hand, we can also name them. It was policy of containment, to be honest, because a weak Afghanistan, an unstable Afghanistan, an Afghanistan which give rise to terrorism could be a threat, serious threat to all these neighboring countries who border with Afghanistan. So the policy of engagement, of course, they also had the countries had some conditions too for that policy. Now, for example, inclusive government, the rights, protection of rights of women and girls, and overall minority rights. Iran has been really focused on the rights of minorities, Shia community to be protected. So all this countries' engagement has also some level of conditions. Do you want me to stop here?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that you mentioned a few key words that I took note, and I would like to get back to you. So we can continue the discussion on the policy of containment and so forth. But let me bring Barney to feel free to comment on what Dr. Sakhi said, but also you were in the region recently, and you also wrote a report in which you wrote about that all of Afghanistan's neighbors have called for an inclusive government in the country. Now that we heard this is basically how we have ended up here, or this is the reality right now, and now the region and the broader global community are calling for something maybe different. So how would you differentiate between the region's understanding of an inclusive government and that of the US and Western countries? And also, how are they similar or different from multiple interpretations of the term among Afghans?
Well, look, I don't know any of those actors that has really defined what they mean by inclusive government. So it's hard to say how they differ from each other. It's good that they have agreed on the same formula, but the problem will come if they try to make it a reality. Now, let me explain why that is the case. As I also wrote in the report, the regional situation is quite different than it's been for some time. First of all, no government in the region recognizes the Taliban. No government anywhere, no government in the world recognizes the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan. And at the same time, no government is waging a proxy war against them. That is, the National Resistance Front, based in Dushanbe, has been looking for some kind of international support, but it hasn't gotten it, except, of course, from Tajikistan, which allows them freedom of movement and so on. And the reason for that is Tajikistan security depends on Russia, and Russia and all the countries of Central Asia know what happened to Pakistan as a result of hosting the Mujahideen in the 1980s. So they absolutely are opposed to any policy that creates a body of armed Afghans on the territory of Central Asia. They absolutely do not want that. That will destabilize all those countries and possibly Russia as well. Second, before, when the Taliban were in power, there was a proxy war against them. Why was there a proxy war against them? Because the Taliban were perceived by other countries in the region, Russia, Iran, India, as proxies of Pakistan. And for some, and for Iran actually thought the Taliban were also proxies of, well, I should say, and of Saudi Arabia, and Iran also thought the Taliban were proxies for the United States. Therefore, there was a perception of threat. And it's important to mention when people perceive threats from Afghanistan, when countries perceive threats from Afghanistan, those are by and large not threats from Afghans who are not in a position by themselves to threaten anyone. They are threats from other powers that are supporting the Afghans. So at that time, there was a proxy war, which was settled for a while when one side won it. Now, why are the Taliban, at the moment, the threat that most countries in the region perceive coming from Afghanistan is ISKP, the Islamic State, and perhaps other forms of criminality and drug trafficking, of course. But the Taliban are opposed to ISKP. They claim they're against drug trafficking, though they're not doing anything about it. But that's not so different from every other government in Afghanistan, actually. And no one sees, very few people see ISKP as a proxy for some outside power. Now, the Iranian special representative, Mr. Khomeini, has claimed that ISKP is supported by the United States. In the last few years, Russia has claimed that ISKP is supported by the United States. In any case, they are satisfied that the Taliban are funding its ISKP. I'm not sure how seriously they mean those charges. But at any rate, that means it's a stable situation temporarily. But the fact that the combination of no country perceiving a threat from another great power through Afghanistan and non-recognition of the Taliban means you have an extremely weak government. Because of course, Afghanistan is also the poorest country in the world. It uses organized violence somewhat effectively, but it doesn't have the capacity to do much else. And the recognition of a government in Afghanistan, which would be an inclusive one, according to what all the countries say, would go hand in hand with the extension of development assistance and other kinds of aid, development and security assistance to that new government. Now, precisely, if there were a political process to form a new government, and now there are some vague rumors about inter-Afghan talks again, reports that President Karzai may leave Afghanistan, go to Germany, and so on. If that happens, you see, then the danger is various countries will promote their own candidates for who is to be in that inclusive government. If assistance starts, then countries will provide assistance to Afghanistan in a way that inevitably, even if it wasn't their intention, when you provide assistance, it strengthens your position there. And if the United States provides a lot of assistance, strengthens its position there, then Russia, China, Iran, and so on may react competitively. So I think the challenge now is there's considerable consensus verbally about non-recognition of the Taliban and the need for an inclusive government. Now, but in the unfortunately unlikely event that the international community, together with Afghans, is able to move beyond that, it will be very important to be careful that in supporting the formation of an inclusive government and providing assistance, we do not relaunch proxy competition and put Afghanistan again in the position of being torn apart by rivalries among great powers. And that's even a greater danger now than it has been for some time because of the extremely hostile relations between the United States and Russia, the difficult relations, and Iran, I should say, and the difficult relations between the United States and China. So I would be very cautious about how to solve these problems because the solution might turn out to be another problem.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rubin, for those important points. I mean, you have made a number of comments that I would like to see if we can pick up on some of them, but maybe on the issue of the comment that pursuit of this policy objective, whatever these countries mean by it, may be difficult. What mechanisms, Mrs. Amon, do you think exist? For example, there is UNAMA, and also maybe others have suggested other formats. And but what approach could keep these countries more together and closer in the pursuit of such a policy?
Thank you so much for having me at this wonderful event, very timely and with the distinguished speakers. Let me just, I mean, a lot of things that I would have said was mentioned here by both Nilüfer and Barney. Let me just briefly focus on the 2022. That something really significant happened that overshadowed almost everything Afghanistan related, and that was the Russian attack on Ukraine. The war, diverted all attention from Afghanistan, and crucially, the financial and humanitarian resources allocated to Afghanistan, to Afghan people, Afghan migrants and refugees were largely shifted to Ukraine. And the other event is the Iran's, most recently Iran's unrest also has pushed the Afghan protests and what's going on in Afghanistan into the background. Currently, regional and international actors, as previous speakers said, have several primary concerns with respect to conditions inside Afghanistan. First, the escalation of extremist violence and deteriorating security situation threaten to spill beyond Afghanistan's borders. The other is Afghan opium production, which is once again on the rise, fueling drug trafficking in the region into Europe. Equally important, as also mentioned, the Taliban's failure to keep its, their promises regarding girls' education and women's rights and providing security to the religious minorities, especially the Shia population. That has really frustrated the international community. The international community made a fundamental mistake in politicizing Afghanistan's financial and humanitarian aid. It is important that Afghan assets are released, but as also was mentioned in the report you mentioned that from the UN, that but it is important that some international institutions such as United Nations or others to monitor that assets to be distributed or spent to make sure that it really helps Afghans, not just the Taliban. It is equally vital not to sever communications links between the international community and the Afghan people. I know Nilüfer mentioned that Taliban may have been, engaged by all of regional players and the neighboring countries, but it is important that I believe, barring representatives of the current regime from regional gatherings, is really could lead to isolation of Afghan people and leave them to at the mercy of the Taliban. I know I generally believe not just about Afghanistan, also Iran and other places. It is important that the communication with Afghanistan is not cut somehow. Afghanistan's neighbors and other regional players each have unique motives, for engaging with whoever rules Afghanistan. Iran, for example, has a long-standing dispute with Kabul over transboundary waters, actually. Hirmand, Iranians call it Hirmand, Afghans call it Helmand. And also the issue of ISK, as Barney mentioned, and other terrorist groups create considerable security concern along Iran's eastern borders. Just recently, a mass shooting at the Shah Cheragh, a Shia shrine in Shiraz, killed at least 13 people, and that was attributed to the ISK infiltrating Iran from Afghanistan. Although Iranians doubted the government's narrative about ISK due to diminishing credibility of the Iranian government, But the truth is that ISK now, can reach cities well inside Iran. In addition to the individual challenges that Afghanistan's neighbors face in dealing with the Taliban, the region as a whole must prevent Afghanistan from becoming once again a haven for international terrorist networks, something that the financial situation of Afghanistan can facilitate this threat. Regional actors need they need a coordinated approach toward the Taliban regime. Right now, there are differences, as Nilüfer mentioned. But the biggest challenge may be that the Taliban is not a homogeneous group that can be a stable and reliable negotiating partner. Taliban actions are, basically factions are at odds with each other, and if they cannot behave like a statesman, which so far they could not have, they have not managed to do that. It will be really very difficult for any country to recognize them. Eventually, the Taliban must overcome its internal differences and take steps forward addressing international demands. Winning international recognition may not be as daunting as a task as it seems. No country wants to be the first to recognize the Taliban as legitimate, but if one finally does, then I can imagine that others will likely follow. I know I did not stay exactly on the question you asked, but the reason is that it's extremely difficult, really, to just find the right approach toward the Taliban, and how it's really very difficult to figure out what to deal with the Taliban. And I would just end it here. I would be happy to answer any other question.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Mon. No, that's very good. And we will come back to that question of approaches. I think that I would like to invite everyone to comment on that. That's probably the heart of the debate, the discussion today. But let me invite Dr. Mir to comment on what was particularly said about the threats emanating from Afghanistan. Historically, the region has viewed at least two major threats from an unstable Afghanistan. One is terrorism and the other is drug trafficking. Reports, including by the UN, show that both of these threats have increased since the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan. So, Dr. Mir, what is your take, and what's the region doing to curb these threats? Also, how do you evaluate the role of regional organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in responding to these types of developments? I would also like to add a comment that Barney made, that the Taliban are opposed to ISKP, and that is one threat that the region feels. What do you think about that? And how really are ISKP different from the Taliban in terms of their ideology and use of tactics and so forth? And how responsible are they themselves in creating the breeding ground and enabling them? But also there are other actors, other groups that the region might feel threatened by from Afghanistan. Thank you, Dr. Mir.
Thank you, Arif, for the introduction as well as the question. Really delighted to be here, part of this company of such a distinguished group, and many thanks to the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame for convening this discussion. So I will try to answer both of your questions, the course of the next few minutes. But let me start here. I think it's important to go back to the pre-withdrawal era and sort of situate where the region was at. I think as the US was withdrawing, or as it appeared that a US withdrawal was imminent, there was this great hope in the region that with the withdrawal of the United States forces, military forces, many of the problems that the region faced with respect to Afghanistan would start to diminish. China, Russia, Iran certainly saw the United States as a dangerous, threatening presence in the region in one of several ways. The Pakistanis wanted the US gone as well, and having supported the Taliban post 9/11, they clearly wanted the Taliban to dominate in a post-American Afghanistan. The Central Asian republics, in particular the Uzbeks, felt that their aspiration of connectivity via Afghanistan could only be realized in a post-American Afghanistan, and that until the Americans stayed there, there'd be a lot of fighting and violence. The Indians were the most vigorously concerned about a US drawdown. And what it would do to the terror landscape, both in Pakistan as well as the threats that have projected into India from Pakistani territory. So that's where the region was at. Today, in August, almost over a year since August 2021, when the Taliban took over, I don't think the region is at where it started. I think today much of the region is fairly concerned about the trajectory of the Taliban, and this concern is shared. There's a consensus on that, and the most significant indicator, something Barney pointed to, is that no one, not even Pakistan, has recognized the Taliban's regime. Of course, many continue to see the US, continue to blame the US as having left behind the conditions which are at the heart of the instability. But they also increasingly find the Taliban's intransigence frustrating, in particular on terrorism. So let me focus on that a little bit. The region was very surprised, even disappointed, by the Taliban bringing Al-Qaeda chief Ayman al-Zawahiri to Kabul. Before the withdrawal, some felt that the United States was overstating Taliban commitments to Al-Qaeda, the threat of Al-Qaeda. They thought it was something that the US was totally playing up. And so their priors were challenged by the discovery of, or the revelation of, Zawahiri being in Kabul, being protected by the Taliban. But then there are other threats. So ISIS, most certainly it is an adversary to the Taliban. It champions a competing sort of ideology. Its political project is built around these Salafi precepts, which are limited to select parts of Afghanistan. So in that sense, they pose a major military as well as an ideological political challenge to the Taliban. But they appear to have not done enough to contain them, constrain them. Some of their tactics appear to be fueling the threat of ISIS, and we see that Russia and much of Central Asia is very concerned about ISIS. Despite the Taliban seeing them as an adversary. The Chinese are concerned about Uyghur jihadists and don't seem to be all that persuaded by the Taliban's assurances, though they're willing to work with them. The Chinese also have concerns about Baloch insurgents, ISIS, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan (TTP), as well as Al-Qaeda to an extent. Largely because of the threat all of these groups pose to BRI, CPEC projects in Pakistan. And then Pakistan, very concerned about the TTP as well as ISIS-K. The TTP in particular has stepped up its violence in Pakistan. And the Pakistanis feel that the Taliban, by protecting and shielding the TTP, fairly brazenly have breached their confidence. Now, India is interesting. It has engaged the Taliban in a way that was not anticipated, including on these Kashmir-focused jihadi groups, Pakistani jihadi groups. But they're still concerned about them, about the Taliban's intentions on them. And to an extent, Indians care about Al-Qaeda as well, which is messaged against India. Now, Iran is very interesting. It is certainly very concerned about ISIS's sort of threat against Iran, especially since the attack by ISIS in Shiraz and the threat ISIS poses to the Hazara Shia population in the country. And so they want the Taliban to forcefully move against ISIS, and they feel the Taliban are not doing that. But Iran also has a relationship with Al-Qaeda, currently housing several Al-Qaeda leaders, including plausibly the next top leader of Al-Qaeda, Saif al-Adil. So there are a lot of threats. Let me round off by talking about how I view the region as thinking about counterterrorism as to what to be done. And I find three dominant views in the region, sometimes articulated by the same regional actor at different times in forums, but let me lay those out. The first view is that counterterrorism can't be done in isolation, that it has to be a package, and they identify political inclusion as being a precursor to effective counterterrorism. The idea seems to be that the Taliban need to expand their political order, incorporate political actors who are not Taliban, largely to reduce the threats that the regime faces. And they think that without the Taliban being more inclusive, terror threats are only going to proliferate, and the lack of inclusion therefore makes the Taliban sort of failure more likely. So that's one view. The other view is that the Taliban need to just get on with counterterrorism. They need to crack down effectively against many of these threats. They need to do a much better job containing ISIS-K, and then they need to sever their ties with allied groups like the TTP, Al-Qaeda, TIP. And they're open to the idea that the Taliban need help on capacity, and that should be provided. But they would really like the Taliban to demonstrate some intent in going after these threats. The third and final view, which seems to be emerging, I think it's still incipient, very early, but this view exists, and I'd say strongly exists among strategists of one regional actor, Pakistan, that there have to be some unilateral options, either covert or overt military options. And we've seen Pakistan carry out airstrikes in Afghanistan earlier this year. I think Iran might have some options up its sleeve as well. You asked about regional initiatives, role of SCO. I think SCO has not been able to come up with a real institutional configuration on CT or a broader set of issues relating to Afghanistan. But one major regional effort I'll quote here was actually led by the Uzbek government. It organized a conference back in July with regional as well as US European participation, and the aim seemed to be to get the Taliban to provide tangible CT assurances, and specifically a clear break from Al-Qaeda. Essentially, as I saw, this was an effort at brokering an improved version of the US Taliban Doha CT Accord. So just specific to CT, and the Uzbek authorities, diplomats seemed confident of securing such an agreement based on consultations with select Taliban leaders in Kabul. And the diplomats were telling Western interlocutors that the Taliban were going to break from Al-Qaeda, that there would be a Doha 2.0. But in the end, the Taliban appear to have refused further discussion on Al-Qaeda, and instead at that conference, we got a very defensive speech by Taliban Foreign Minister Muttaqi. And then less than a month later, the U.S. government targeted Al-Qaeda leader Zawahiri in Kabul. So that's the extent of regional coordination I assess on counterterrorism. But I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that all of you are probably referring to that there are common threats that the region feels from Afghanistan, from terrorism, drug trafficking, the possibility of probably maybe armed opposition, or as some call proxy wars. But also I would like to highlight the role of Afghans themselves, who are not willing to tolerate an exclusive hold of power by the Taliban alone. But nonetheless, there are common threats to the region. And so the region has basically two challenges: is working with each other, as you pointed out some of their differences and some of the ways or in different places where each feels threatened. And then the other challenge is working with Afghans in order to pursue those objectives and how they can find common ground. So I would like to circle back and ask what mechanisms could be utilized, and also is the region providing enough leadership, or are they still waiting for the U.S. Or other countries to do something on Afghanistan? And we know UNAMA is there, but Uzbekistan also recently called for an international group to negotiate with the Taliban. So does that mean that that UNAMA is not enough, or that other mechanisms are also necessary? I will just ask that question, pose it to all of you, and maybe we'll just go in the same order and have Nilüfer Can comment. If we could keep comments between 2 to 3 minutes, if possible, that would be great. I have a long list of questions from our audience that I would like to ask after this round.
Thank you, Arif. I think the previous platforms for regional coordination and consensus building hasn't been very productive. Starting from a CEO, Heart of Asia, 6+2 regional peace format, and many other. I mean, the countries also took lead in the past. Dushanbe, Moscow, Tehran at some point. I mean, based on the result of all this event, I don't think that those have been productive. And most of them ended up with a very formal statements from the first layer of governments, and mostly work as a track one approach. One country taking lead in the region is also not a reasonable way to go forward. Why? Because that will undermine the neutrality of the process, and there are lots of differences in policy of engagement with Afghanistan also in the region that the countries may not get together at some point. For example, at some point, some of us were arguing and advocating for a regional process to include Saudis, Iranians, Moscow, Pakistan, Central Asian state, China, all at the table, you know. That's how you bring consensus building, when all the actors with the convergent views and interests come at the table and negotiate. But that's not possible. That hasn't been possible in the past to bring all these actors together. And I think one of my fear, which I recently looked at these events happening around Afghanistan political reconciliation, is there's a fear that it might create East and West bloc in the region, if one country in the region or any power in the region take lead on the process. So that bloc creation is also will not be in favor of Afghanistan peace and prosperity, and also for the region. That will add to another prolonged conflict and a proxy war even inside Afghanistan. So what my proposal would be is a neutral party, at least. We have seen in the past that hasn't been productive so much, but at least we can experiment it again. The UN engagement, and UN should intervene. They have a political mandate, and through that political mandate, they intervene in the current context. And as Asfanyar mentioned, everything is going back to Afghanistan's internal stability, and that has to create an inclusive government. And a second step should be the consensus building in the region, and that political mandate of the UN through the UN platform could start from a political inclusion and political settlement inside the country, moves forward with bringing countries in the region and consensus building of the region. So that should be a stepwise approach to address all. And one of the important points which came out of my work, at least, as every one of us are talking about, is the security of these countries are so interconnected. And the security in Afghanistan is connected to Pakistan, to Iran, and the same goes back, even go beyond to the other countries far in the region. So I think security is the common interest of all these countries. And that common interest should be negotiated at the table, that in a very realpolitik manner, to be honest, and not in our idealist way of generating statements at the end, but what countries give and take for the protection of that security. That discussion, I think, hasn't happened in the past. That should happen, and a neutral platform can lead that. I stopped.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So basically, could UNAMA or another regional mechanism or something else could bring these actors to work together in a coordinated manner, as some of the people mentioned here? Mr. Rubin, to you.
Well, thank you. First, I'd like to mention that there's an ongoing political, I don't know what to call it, crisis, dispute, split in Afghanistan. It's been going on since 2001 and before, and has not been resolved at all. And the issue of inclusiveness does not address it. I'll just say about inclusiveness, the easiest way for countries to push inclusiveness is to ask the Taliban to appoint some people that they know as ministers or something. The Taliban offered Ahmed Massoud a ministry, but he wisely did not accept that. So that's not inclusiveness. Inclusiveness means giving opportunities for the people of Afghanistan to participate in self-governance. Now, however, what does that mean? The social processes unleashed by the war that began in 1979 actually very much destroyed the structures of the old Afghan state, which was a highly centralized state controlled by a small group of Pashtun elites and some of their non-Pashtun clients with whom they intermarried. And there was a brief sort of semi-consensus produced around the Bonn Agreement and then the Constitution. Although having been involved in both of those, I know that those were issues at that time. Now, there's a very clear difference. Most of the non-Pashtuns involved in opposition to the Taliban don't define themselves as being in opposition to the Taliban. They define themselves as being in opposition to Pashtun monopoly of power in Afghanistan. And they want decentralization, which they have never defined. So what their opponents understand from decentralization is they want a weak government. They want a weak central government. Actually, they're very much against it. But that is, I think, and figuring out terms of participation in a highly centralized government, an authoritarian government like the Taliban, is not going to address that question. It will leave it unanswered. I don't know if there is a way of doing it. I just mentioned that there are now some discussions about doing something like repeating the Bonn process. I don't know, you may have seen recently that supposedly the intelligence chief of the Taliban, Mr. Wasiq, went to see President Karzai and told him that he could leave Afghanistan for Germany, that was in connection with some discussions that are taking place between Tom West in the State Department and Sahel Shaheen in Doha about possibly some inter-Afghan dialogue. I don't know, but I think equally important as what international organization take the lead is what Afghans can take the lead, because we can't just have an international organization convening a random group of Afghans. And it may be, and I don't want to romanticize these people or anything, but the fact that President Karzai and Dr. Abdullah, who are on opposite sides of the political divide that I just mentioned, have remained in Afghanistan, have kept their links to the Taliban open, are now apparently being able to go back and forth, may indicate that they'll be able to play a key role, even though I know everybody's tired of those people, those people from the old regime. But we may have to call on them for some kind of a transitional role.
Thank you. And maybe now I will bring a question that has been asked by people. So then Dr. Mir and Ms. Starmann could comment on it, and some of them have addressed it to you, Mr. Rubin, as well. For example, at least 3 people have written. Dr. Marvin from the Middle East Institute has written that an inclusive government is a red line for the Taliban. Is their thinking any real power sharing would be to surrender in their thinking, any real power sharing would be to surrender their vision of an Islamic state and everything they fought for. It matters not for the Taliban whether there is an international consensus. Lendora Howard Diawara has written, are the Taliban interested in a government of inclusion? If so, what are some of their motivations? In the same way, Said Dawood has written, Mr. Rubin, how feasible do you see the question of inclusivity when it comes to Taliban, especially on ideological grounds? Absolutely, the issue of domestic leadership, but also on what the region could do to work together among themselves before they could even approach Afghanistan, how they could work with each other on Afghanistan, on mechanisms, and on these 3 comments that I shared. Dr. Mir, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Ari, would you like me to address
Yes,
those
please.
questions?
Go ahead. We'll go to Mrs. Zaman and then we'll circle back.
Okay. So I will, I want to go back to the last question you posed to the group on what can the region do. And I think it's very important that the region starts speaking in one voice to the Taliban, and that there is more coordination and that they can iron out some of their differences and send the same message. And we see some attempts at that already. So, for example, in the regional meeting that took place in Moscow recently, convened by the Russians, the Taliban were not invited, which was a way for the region, in my view, to tell the Taliban that the region is concerned about the Taliban's trajectory, not happy with many of the policies that they have adopted. So I think that's that's one way to communicate, and it's likely to generate a degree of leverage. The other thing the region can do is clarify a roadmap to recognition for the Taliban, come up with some common set of expectations. Certainly the region is talking about inclusion and the importance of the Taliban making their government inclusive, but as Barney noted, there is no clear definition of what inclusion is or what it actually entails, and this problem really predates the Taliban in many ways. So if the region can coordinate and solve this collective action problem on what they all mean by inclusion, and then append to that some other steps that the Taliban can take to gain their recognition, I think that would also bring a degree of pressure on the Taliban and clarifies the steps that they need to take to become more normal. So I'd really like to see the region progress in that direction.
Thank you so much. Ms. Samon, would you like to share your thoughts on the region's approach, both working with each other, but also working with Afghans?
Very briefly, apparently I'm, completely, I have different, opinion regarding the Taliban being included in the regional, gatherings, conferences, or whatever. I don't know, to be honest with you, I don't know if that works, the threat of being isolated. not being included and not being invited. I don't know if that helps, Taliban's, if that improves Taliban's behavior, and the problem that I was wondering if Esfandiar could mention the rifts and differences within the Taliban. That is one issue that prevents, doing everything that the Taliban pledged to do in the beginning, that to form an inclusive government and to secure the rights of education for girls and everything, and the minority rights, security, improving security. So the longer it takes, the situation has, in the beginning, they were really trying to impress the international community. First, just maybe they wanted to calm the situation inside inside Afghanistan to, for the opposition movements not to be formed. And they wanted the international recognition. So none of them they have at this point. The longer it takes, the worse the situation gets, and the Taliban it's going to be harder to engage with the Taliban, to just I don't know if that is a good idea to exclude them, from any gathering, that any regional say conference that involves Afghanistan. Because right now, unfortunately, because there is no other alternative at this point, that is what worries me. That if you just isolate the Taliban more than before, you would perhaps push them toward those international terrorist networks. In the beginning, no one thought that they would host Al-Qaeda. And that is, I know they are at odds with, they are in fight with the ISK, but to just getting closer to terrorist other networks, that is, I don't think that's a good outcome. That,
Thank you, Mrs. Zaman. Some people would argue that including them in the past several years have actually given them everything, and it didn't push them away from terrorist groups. In fact, they hosted Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda's leader, and so, which is a big evidence of how inclusion also has actually had negative impacts in the way that it has been handled. But broader, let me just back up again and look at the broader question of the question of inclusivity. I think that maybe there are two formats that people are talking about. Broadly speaking, it's difficult to say what exactly each country means. And within Afghan factions as well, we would have to look at what every faction means. But broadly speaking, there's an acceptable format for most non-Taliban factions. And that is a new format, a new government where all parties come together and form something new. And then there's another format, is a Taliban inclusive, basically, Taliban-dominated system, which is not acceptable to other factions. And we don't know if that is what the region will want or not, because even if they get that, that is not going to resolve the question, as Mr. Rubin also mentioned. This has been an issue for a long time. And so we might have to look at it at the root and resolve it here. Mrs. Sahi, Dr. Sahi, what are your thoughts to the previous comments and questions that I shared from the audience on whether the Taliban will be willing to be part of an inclusive process, whether international consensus on this inclusivity has any impact on them, and what mechanism really exists? What approach could the region take to move forward?
Well, I think it's time to evaluate the engagement. There has been engagement from last 1 year with the Taliban, both at the very high level and the managerial level too, for the humanitarian assistance that most of international organizations were engaged with them to provide the services to the people, but Taliban were engaged in all those processes. And at the top level, the political level also, there were a couple of events in Europe that Taliban were invited. In the region, of course, they have been traveling at the capitals of the countries and meeting and greeting their counterparts. Now, what has engagement brought? What was the result of engagement? What was the impact of engagement that the Taliban change? Has it brought any kind of flexibility in their approaches to two areas that the international community and the regional countries were pushing, the inclusivity and the protection of rights? There were two areas that everyone has been talking even during the Doha process. So whether that has changed or not, so that evaluation I think we all have to make while articulating further different level of engagement with them in future. I also don't agree with the fact that there is lack of articulation about the inclusivity. And Afghans have been talking from last 1 year about the forms, kinds, and format of inclusivity. And it seems nobody is hearing them because there has been a number of informal, formal platforms where Afghans wanted to convey the message to the world that what kind of inclusivity they are looking to. And of course, one has been mentioned, there are formats like decentralization, federalism, but then other formats, a temporary political settlement for 2 years, interim government. They all were formats and kinds where at least this central system that's now the Taliban have made that should break. And that could create discussion, that could create a dialogue among Afghans that what kind of inclusivity they are looking for. Because at this time, Taliban, I think they should be also part of those processes. But considering them as the only reality of Afghanistan, I think it's a mistake of all of us. Taliban is not, and they are not, the only reality of the country. There are other realities that people have been talking about it from last 1 year. And I think this is a time that those realities should be included, at least any voice that they have, they should be in the process. And for that, there should be a push for the Taliban to accept at least the initial move for inclusivity, to bring some more and start discussion and dialogue about what kind of government these Afghan people want to move forward. That hasn't happened. The international community failed to make that happen. The regional countries failed. The regional platforms failed to make that happen. Taliban were not flexible. Taliban were not adjusting to the fact that they are not only the reality, they are still acting as an autocratic totalitarian system as the only player in the room. And this is not going to help Afghanistan for the long term because that can create further ethnic crisis, which we are seeing the signs from here, that could create further small groups of pockets of insurgency to arise from different parts, and then the neighboring countries can use them as a proxy or support them because they will turn their faces, the small insurgencies, pockets of insurgency, they will turn their faces to their sponsors in the region. And they will involve them, bring them in if their needs and grievances are not met. So in any conflict, we have to bring everyone at the table. And that wasn't, the Doha process failed because the intra-Afghan element did not produce a political settlement. That's why it was a flawed process. It was a failed process. And of course, the President Ghani fled the country and all the other chaos that left with the Taliban forceful takeover. So that was a failure process. So the political settlement, reconciliation that from last many years, many of us in the peacemaking area has been asking and pushing, that did not happen at all. So when that didn't happen, how we can expect a country with no crisis and conflict? Of course there would be. Of course, these pockets of insurgency will turn into a bigger insurgency in the future if it's not tackled. So I think, again, going back to the inclusivity, I think there are and there has been discussion about what kind of inclusivity, how and what format of inclusivity. But that has to come under one platform. And that's why I'm saying a neutral party can come and convene, bring all these voices together and create that dialogue among Afghans that of course the Taliban is also part of that, to generate a kind of a system that Afghans first have consensus over, and that they will go beyond talk about the regional security and other elements. So the solution is inside Afghanistan. The solution is not in the region. The solution is inside. Until this is not diagnosed well internally, and the prescription is not provided, and all the actors will not add to the solution, I think expecting something from the region would be a mistake.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sahi. Mr. Rubin, I'll just pass it to you. You've been hearing all the questions. Please let me know if I need to repeat them, but to you.
Well, of course, you could say that the past couple of years of engagement with the Taliban have not produced much. The previous 20 years of hostility toward the Taliban, putting them under sanctions, war, sending them to Guantanamo, didn't produce much either. I think we're faced with an organization that is very difficult to influence. And it's whatever people suggest, it's extremely easy to prove that it won't work. Okay. What's almost impossible is to find something that has even a slim chance of working. Now, what's the situation in the Taliban? The situation in the Taliban is that the emir has complete power, and that everyone has to obey the emir. And even members of his own government do not have influence over him. It appears that even members of the family of Mullah Omar and of Jalaluddin Haqqani do not have influence over him. Nonetheless, we know that I wouldn't say there are not splits, there are not factions, but there are people with different views in the Taliban. One of them, at least, is very outspoken. That is Abbas Stanikzai. And he wouldn't be able to get on television and say those things if he didn't have higher level support from Sirajuddin Haqqani and Yaqub Omari and others. But there's no process within the Taliban for making those, by which that opinion in the Taliban can influence policy. So I think the idea, okay, we give up the idea of trying to overthrow the Taliban through military force or trying to eliminate it. Then we are left with the idea of trying to influence it. Now, I think the idea of trying to influence the leader by offering him recognition or something is probably completely useless because he doesn't care about those things. There are people in the Taliban who do, but the trouble is we don't know about the internal political processes of the Taliban. They're inside a black box for us. So we don't know how to interact with them. So I think this is not the only thing to do, but one thing to do is try to engage them, not thinking that you're going to convince the leader to change his policy. You won't. But to understand what the different currents of thought are and who has influence in one way or another. Second, I don't know if I have a second, but just create, if you're going to go and find people inside the Taliban that are maybe more sympathetic to the ideas of the Afghan opposition and the international community, there are such people. That doesn't mean that they're disloyal or they're not Taliban. Believe they think they might. Then you have to create an environment where they have something to show their opponents inside the Taliban, that they can produce something. And that's very difficult because then, people say, I guess a number of people here have talked about the idea, something like a roadmap to recognition. If they do X, Y, and Z, then if not recognition, at least they'll receive more aid or something different. It has to be kind of a quid pro quo, some kind of a deal. Now, the leader will not accept that. I have no doubt about it. But there are people within the Taliban that might want to push for it. somehow or other. It would be a long process, and we can't predict how, if at all, it would work. Now, the other thing that might happen, of course, is that there could be a crisis at some point. That's quite likely. I don't know what form it would take. Nobody knows what it would take. Nobody foresaw 9/11. But after all, the government has a weak fiscal basis. We'll have to see what happens in the spring, how widespread opposition turns out to be. I know that NRF is planning what they hope will be a large offensive, and others may be doing that as well. We'll have to see. And Afghanistan cannot remain, under any government, totally indifferent to its neighbors because it is landlocked. I think let's not look for the philosopher's stone or something, some formula that we know will work. So there is no such thing. I think we just have to pursue several lines of effort and bit by bit and learn from the experience.
Well, thank you so much. We don't have a lot of time left, so I would like to conclude. I know that it's difficult to conclude this conversation, so maybe we will have to continue it at another time. But a few things that I heard throughout the discussion is that the Afghans will have to work together, all factions, or there will be crisis, or this challenge will continue, not only for us, but also for the region and the wider international community. And the region has understood this. Please go ahead.
I just had a very brief, I just wanted to mention, maybe it would be worthwhile to think about setting up the political office of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, maybe in Doha.
Thank you. Thank you.
And where, Barney? Where?
I said maybe in Doha.
Thank you for that comment. And anyhow, so the situation is difficult and the answers are also difficult. Like I said, we're not going to conclude the discussion, but hopefully we'll continue it. Because we have to find a solution, or the challenges and these crises will continue, and will just continue to haunt not just Afghans, but the region and the broader international community as well. And I would like to conclude with a statement that came from one of the audience, from one of our viewers, who said that in all of this discussion, we have to also ask what the people of Afghanistan want, not just what the Taliban wish to hear. So thank you so much for all of your time and expertise that you shared with us today. And also thanks to our viewers who stayed with us. I also would like to thank Dr. Schirch for being with us, and Lisa Gallagher and the Kroc Institute for hosting the event. I wish you a good day, and until next time.